In the early 1900s, alcohol was not just a drink. People argued about what it did to families, wages, and safety. Temperance activists framed the issue as protection and moral reform, while many households saw drinking as ordinary life. This tension created a political engine powered by emotion, religion, and social change. Prohibition starts long before 1920, because laws follow movements that learn to organize. The question wasn't only, is alcohol bad, but can a nation outlaw a habit without creating something worse? Temperance grew because it built networks. Meetings, fundraising, pamphlets, and local chapters that coordinated like a machine. Organizers connected churches, civic groups, and voters across states, turning moral persuasion into political power. This is how reform movements scale: repeatable routines, shared symbols, and reliable communication. By the 1910s, temperance wasn't a single voice, it was a distributed system. Once a system exists, it starts looking for the biggest lever it can pull. To supporters, saloons represented more than drinking. They symbolized political machines, exploitation, and unsafe streets. To opponents, saloons were social hubs and immigrant community centers, places where life happened after work. When one building becomes a symbol, politics becomes simpler and louder. The press amplified these images, spreading local conflicts into national narratives. Prohibition gained momentum by turning complex social problems into a single villain, the bottle. World War I changed the political weather. Arguments about grain, discipline, and national unity made restrictions easier to sell. Reformers linked alcohol to wasted resources and weakened readiness, adding a new lever to the temperance campaign. Government paperwork and wartime controls proved that big federal action was possible. Once people accept emergency rules, permanent rules become easier to imagine. The movement aimed upward, not just local bans, but a constitutional switch. Temperance leaders realized that patchwork state laws created loopholes, so they pursued a constitutional amendment. An amendment is the strongest lever. It changes the rules for everyone, everywhere, at once. This strategy reframed temperance as nation-building, using law to shape culture. Opponents warned that enforcing a private behavior at national scale would be messy and expensive, but momentum and organization pushed the plan forward. As the dry push grew, wet opposition learned to organize: brewers, workers, and voters who saw prohibition as overreach. The debate sharpened into two competing stories: personal freedom versus public protection. When politics becomes a story war, compromises get harder. Newspapers and rallies turned policy details into emotional slogans. By 1918 to 1919, the country was primed for a dramatic legal change. Amendments require a ratification race, and temperance networks treated it like a campaign with checklists and deadlines. State by state, support flipped, and the map changed color in meeting rooms far from Washington. This is the power of distributed organizing. Small actions repeated everywhere become a national transformation. Critics argued the speed mattered. Fast change can outpace careful planning. But the ratification train kept moving. In 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified, and the country legally committed to banning intoxicating liquors. Supporters celebrated a moral victory and a promise of safer communities. Opponents immediately asked, what exactly counts as intoxicating, and who will police it? The amendment was a destination for reformers, but it was also a starting gun for unintended consequences. A giant national experiment was about to begin. Before the ban fully took effect, many people tried to stock up, treating the coming change like a storm warning. Bars, restaurants, and households rearranged routines, unsure what enforcement would really look like. Whenever a product is threatened, demand can spike, an early sign of black market incentives. The nation was about to learn a basic rule of economics: if demand stays, supply finds a path. Prohibition's first impact was not sobriety, it was uncertainty. By 1919, the movement had achieved what reformers dream of: change the Constitution itself. But winning a law is different from running a system, and prohibition would be judged by enforcement, not intentions. The country had built the switch that could turn alcohol off, yet it had not built the infrastructure to control what happens next. Systems punish gaps. Demand, profit, and habit flow into any open space. Act 2 begins when the faucet turns, and the hidden river of supply starts searching for new channels. When Prohibition began in 1920, the law didn't erase alcohol, it changed who could sell it and how risky it became. Legal supply shut down, but demand remained, so prices rose and incentives shifted overnight. Enforcement agencies were created or expanded, but they started underfunded and understaffed compared to the size of the country. This mismatch is the enforcement gap, a big rule with small capacity. The black market forms in the shadow of that gap. The 18th Amendment created the goal, but the Volstead Act defined the details, including what counted as illegal. Details matter because they create loopholes, exceptions, and confusion on the street. Courts would soon be flooded with cases testing definitions and boundaries. Every legal definition becomes a map for smugglers. It shows what to avoid and where to hide. A ban is not a wall. It is a rulebook, and rulebooks can be gamed. Prohibition included exceptions, medicinal and sacramental use, that created legal islands inside the ban. Exceptions are politically necessary, but they also create pathways for abuse and gray markets. Families and doctors navigated confusing rules, while fraudsters learned how to mimic legitimacy. A system with exceptions needs strong verification, or the exceptions become the system. This is where paper alcohol begins. Permissions that look official become valuable commodities. Enforcement quickly ran into a numbers problem. Too few agents, too many cities, too many miles of border and coastline. Even honest enforcement can't cover everything, so enforcement becomes selective, targeting easy wins instead of total control. Selective enforcement changes behavior. Criminals adapt to avoid the hotspots and move into the gaps. Local police were often reluctant, overloaded, or politically pressured. The law existed everywhere, but enforcement was uneven everywhere too. When legal supply vanished, many people tried to make alcohol at home, turning kitchens and basements into small factories. Home production spreads because it's decentralized, hard to police, and easy to hide. But quality control collapses in decentralized production, increasing risk and fear. This is a classic unintended consequence. The ban can reduce legal drinking while increasing dangerous drinking. The system shifts from regulated goods to improvised chemistry. Early raids aimed to demonstrate that the law was real, destroying illegal stock and making examples. Raids are theatrical policy tools. They try to change behavior by being seen. But raids can also advertise profit by proving the goods exist and are valuable. Reporters turn raids into stories, sometimes helping enforcement, sometimes glamorizing the chase. A crackdown can accidentally market the black market. Banning a popular product raises its price by adding risk, and higher prices attract professional suppliers. This is bootleg math. If demand is stable, risk becomes a fee paid to criminals and corrupt intermediaries. Organized crime saw a business opportunity with huge margins. Drivers, distributors, and protection networks formed quickly because profit funded coordination. The ban didn't eliminate alcohol. It created a premium market for it. Where enforcement is scarce and profits are high, bribery becomes a shortcut. Corruption doesn't need everyone to be corrupt, only a few key gatekeepers at the right choke points. Bootleggers targeted police, inspectors, and politicians who controlled raids, permits, or court outcomes. This turned Prohibition into a trust crisis. People stopped believing the law was fair. A law that looks hypocritical loses moral power fast. Many Americans obeyed the law, but many also learned to bend it, especially in cities where speakeasies multiplied. When illegal behavior becomes common, enforcement feels arbitrary and respect for the rule weakens. People began treating Prohibition like a game. Passwords, hidden doors, and donations instead of sales. Journalists chronicled the contradiction, feeding both criticism and curiosity. The law was creating a culture of casual illegality. By the end of 1920, the country learned the central flaw. A nationwide ban requires nationwide capacity, and capacity was nowhere near enough. That gap became the business plan for bootleggers and crime syndicates. Every unguarded border, every underpaid officer, every crowded courtroom became part of the new supply chain. Prohibition was no longer a moral debate, it was a market with rules and profits. Act 3 follows the routes as the black market builds a logistics empire. Off the coasts, rum-running fleets waited just beyond easy jurisdiction, turning the ocean into a floating warehouse. Small boats shuttled crates to shore, exploiting darkness, weather, and thin patrol coverage. This is supply chain thinking. Store goods at a safe node, then distribute through smaller, faster links. Enforcement chased boats, but geography favored smugglers with many routes. Prohibition transformed coastlines into contested logistics spaces. The northern border became a classic enforcement nightmare. Long, varied terrain with countless crossings. Smugglers used cars, sleds, and trains, switching methods as seasons changed. Borders are not walls. They are systems of checkpoints and patrols, and systems have weak spots. Enforcement could win locally but lose nationally because the line was too long. Bootlegging turned geography into an advantage. In rural areas, moonshine production spread because it was hidden, local, and hard to trace. Decentralized supply is resilient. Shutting down one still doesn't stop the network. For some families, moonshining became income in regions with limited opportunities. Enforcement raids could disrupt, but the knowledge and demand remained. The ban unintentionally created new rural microeconomies. Large cities became distribution hubs where supply chains could hide inside normal commerce. Warehouses, delivery trucks, and rail yards. Organized crime specialized in coordination, paying drivers, bribing gatekeepers, and controlling territory. The system looked like business: schedules, inventory, and risk management. Police faced an information problem. The goods were hidden among millions of legitimate movements. Prohibition created a new logistics profession. Speakeasies needed steady supply, so owners built relationships with smugglers and distributors. This linked nightlife directly to the smuggling network. A hidden door depended on a hidden route. Jazz and dancing made the scene glamorous, but the system behind it was logistics and bribery. A club owner's main skill was risk management. Who to trust, who to pay, when to hide. Prohibition turned entertainment into a supply chain endpoint. Not all illegal alcohol came from barrels. Some came from diverted industrial supplies meant for factories and labs. When a banned product has legal cousins, criminals exploit the similarity in paperwork. Regulators tried to track barrels with forms and stamps, but paper systems can be forged or corrupted. This is a cat-and-mouse game between bureaucratic verification and criminal adaptation. The ban forced government to become an auditor and criminals to become counterfeiters. To respond, enforcement expanded patrol tactics. More cars, more boats, and better coordination. But every enforcement improvement raised the stakes, pushing smugglers to innovate faster. This is an arms race where each side learns and upgrades. The public saw dramatic chases, but the deeper contest was information and logistics. Prohibition turned law enforcement into a modernizing force under constant pressure. As profits grew, competition required rules, so crime groups began enforcing their own order over neighborhoods and routes. Protection became a product. Pay for safety, pay for access, pay to avoid trouble. This resembles governance, but without accountability. It's taxation by force of reputation and fear. Speakeasy owners and drivers became clients inside a criminal state. Prohibition unintentionally funded alternative institutions. Arrests increased, but courts and prisons were not built for the volume, creating backlogs and uneven punishment. When enforcement overwhelms the legal system, deterrence weakens because consequences become inconsistent. Ordinary families saw neighbors punished, while bigger operators escaped through lawyers and bribes. This perception of unfairness accelerated public cynicism. A system that cannot process its own rules starts to lose legitimacy. By the mid-1920s, illegal supply had become a nationwide network. Coastal rum, border liquor, rural moonshine, and urban distribution. Networks are resilient because they reroute when pressured. Prohibition enforcement could win battles, but the system kept moving around them. The ban had created a shadow economy that touched nightlife, politics, and policing. Act 4 shows how this shadow economy became normal social life in speakeasy America. Speakeasies spread because they offered what people wanted: social life, music, and the thrill of the forbidden. A hidden door and a whispered password turned ordinary drinking into a small adventure. When a behavior becomes a ritual, it becomes sticky, harder to erase with laws. Clubs created jobs too: musicians, waiters, doormen, and suppliers. Prohibition didn't stop nightlife. It remodeled it. The 1920s cultural boom, jazz, dance, and new fashions made Prohibition feel outdated to many urban Americans. When culture shifts quickly, laws that try to freeze behavior can feel like a different era's command. Media coverage helped turn speakeasy life into a national image of modernity. This didn't mean everyone approved. It meant the law was losing its monopoly on social norms. A ban that becomes a joke becomes a weak ban. The era saw changing roles for women, new jobs, new public presence, and new cultural expectations. Some women supported Prohibition as protection for families. Others found speakeasies part of modern social freedom. This made the conflict more complicated than men drink, women oppose. Prohibition collided with a broader transformation of American life. When one reform tries to control behavior while society is changing, backlash becomes likely. As speakeasies and home supply spread, many people knew someone who could get alcohol, even if they didn't drink themselves. This is how illegality normalizes. It becomes part of social networks, rather than a shocking crime. Police faced community resistance. Neighbors didn't always cooperate with raids. Journalists captured the hypocrisy, increasing public debate and cynicism. A law that most people quietly evade becomes hard to defend. Because alcohol was illegal, quality control weakened. Bottles were diluted, relabeled, or mixed unsafely. Consumers couldn't rely on regulation, and even careful people faced uncertainty. This created fear and tragedy risk, adding a public health dimension to the policy debate. Enforcement sometimes focused on dangerous suppliers, but tracking them was difficult. The ban replaced regulated risk with unregulated risk. Restaurants and hotels lost legal liquor sales, cutting profits and changing business models. Some adapted by going dry, while others quietly partnered with speakeasy supply. Whenever a law destroys a revenue stream, businesses search for substitutes, legal or not. This created winners and losers, reshaping city economies. Prohibition's impact was not just moral, it was financial. A raid could shut a place down, but it could also create buzz and sympathy if the public loved the venue. Enforcement actions became part of nightlife mythology. Stories that made Prohibition feel like a game. Local politics mattered. Mayors, police chiefs, and judges influenced how hard the crackdown hit. Journalists amplified the drama, sometimes turning criminals into celebrities. The policy battle moved from law books into popular culture. Younger Americans often treated Prohibition differently. Some as rebellion, some as fashion, some as background noise. Norms shift when a new generation grows up inside a rule and learns how to bypass it. Temperance activists saw this as moral decay. Others saw it as hypocrisy exposed. A law that fails to shape the next generation's habits is a law on borrowed time. Prohibition was losing the future. As illegal drinking normalized, strict adherence to Prohibition became concentrated among committed supporters rather than the broad public. When a law becomes a cultural identity rather than a shared rule, enforcement becomes political combat. Economically, demand remained strong enough to sustain large illegal supply chains. Politically, scandals and hypocrisy eroded trust. The system drifted toward repeal pressure. By the mid-1920s, Prohibition had produced an entire supporting world. Clubs, suppliers, protectors, and customers. This world wasn't hidden at the edges, it was embedded in city life. When illegal systems become infrastructure, removing them requires more than arrests. It requires changing incentives. The cultural story shifted from ban to save society to ban creates chaos. Act 5 shows the darker side. Crime and corruption scaling up with the profits. High profits encouraged consolidation. Smaller gangs were absorbed or pushed aside by larger organizations. With scale came bureaucracy, accounting, territory management, and standardized bribery payments. This is how crime becomes enterprise. Predictable revenue supports predictable organization. The black market began to mirror legitimate business structures, but without legal constraints. Prohibition acted like venture capital for organized crime. Protection money became a tax on nightlife and distribution. Pay to operate, pay to avoid trouble, pay to stay supplied. This tax raised prices further, making alcohol even more profitable and more worth fighting over. Local corruption often followed. A few compromised officials could protect a whole operation. The public learned to associate prohibition with gangster power rather than moral reform. A ban that funds predators loses legitimacy. Corruption spread through webs, not single bribes. Money moved from suppliers to protectors to political patrons. Once embedded, corruption creates self-defense. Insiders punish whistleblowers and protect the pipeline. Journalists expose scandals, but exposure didn't always equal reform when profits were enormous. Honest officials were outnumbered by the system's incentives. Prohibition turned ethics into a battlefield. Enforcement required money, agents, patrols, labs, courts. But prohibition also reduced alcohol tax revenue that once funded government. That created a policy paradox. The ban increased costs while reducing a key revenue stream. Courts clogged, prisons filled, and budgets stretched, forcing hard choices about priorities. When a policy costs more than the public will pay, political support collapses. The numbers quietly pushed the country toward repeal long before the vote. Competition for routes and territory sometimes led to intimidation and violence, but the deeper mechanism was reputation. A feared reputation can reduce the need for constant fighting. People comply to avoid trouble. That is why organized crime invested in image, suits, cars, and whispers that traveled faster than bullets. Even without showing gore, we can show how fear becomes a management tool. Prohibition gave criminals a stage to build reputations. Federal agents depended on local cooperation, but local politics often pulled the other way. Some cities tolerated speakeasies, while others cracked down, creating a patchwork of pressure. Smugglers adapted by moving operations to friendlier jurisdictions. This shows a key systems lesson. Uneven rules create migration toward weak enforcement. Prohibition struggled because it was national in law but local in practice. High-profile trials and scandals became public spectacles, shaping opinion as much as actual enforcement results. Headlines, without needing to read them, moved emotion, outrage, humor, fatigue, and cynicism. Families judged the policy by what they saw: corruption, chaos, and inconsistency. The optics war matters because democracies run on perceived legitimacy. Prohibition was losing the story battle. Smugglers innovated quickly: faster cars, hidden compartments, decoy routes, and better scouts. Enforcement responded with roadblocks and patrols, but innovation kept widening the chessboard. This is a technology race driven by profit. The side with more money can iterate faster. Bootleg driving became a training ground for later car culture and policing tactics. Prohibition changed American mobility and enforcement methods. Even some supporters began questioning whether the outcomes matched the intentions. If a policy reduces one harm but increases others, crime, corruption, dangerous products, public support splinters. Families weighed everyday reality against moral ideals, and the balance shifted in many places. Meanwhile, budgets strained and tax revenue was still missing. The coalition that passed the amendment began to crack. By the late 1920s, the enforcement arms race was locked in. More raids, more evasion, more corruption, more profit. The system fed itself through feedback loops, making simple fixes ineffective. Public opinion was now shaped by costs, money, trust, safety, rather than the original moral goal alone. When a policy becomes a machine that produces scandals, the political clock starts ticking. Act 6 follows the cracks: courts, safety fears, and backlash that make repeal imaginable. By the late 1920s, courts were overwhelmed by prohibition cases, slowing justice for everything else too. When courts clog, deterrence weakens, and cynicism grows, because outcomes feel random. Agents spent time on paperwork instead of prevention, while bigger networks hired better lawyers. This made the law look unequal: small offenders punished, large offenders protected. A policy that breaks the court system breaks its own credibility. Unregulated alcohol sometimes carried serious health risks, and fear spread through communities. Even people who disliked prohibition worried that the ban had pushed drinking into more dangerous forms. Public health concerns became part of the debate. Is the law protecting people or endangering them? Journalists reported tragedies and rumors, intensifying emotion and pressure. The ban's moral clarity blurred into anxiety. Scandals involving bribed officials and selective enforcement hit public trust like repeated punches. When a law is enforced by people who don't believe in it, the law becomes a performance rather than a rule. Journalists exposed payoffs, while reformers argued the solution was stricter enforcement, not repeal. But the public increasingly saw a system that rewarded dishonesty. Trust is a resource. Once spent, it is hard to refill. As enforcement occasionally hit respectable neighborhoods, middle-class voters asked why ordinary behavior was treated like crime. When large numbers of voters feel criminalized, political support collapses quickly. Judges and lawmakers received petitions and complaints, sensing the ground shifting. This wasn't only about drinking, it was about the relationship between citizens and the state. Prohibition was turning into a legitimacy crisis. Some agencies tried to pivot toward targeting large suppliers and criminal enterprises, rather than chasing every small violation. This is rational triage, but it also admits the law cannot be fully enforced. Targeting big networks required intelligence, informants, and long investigations, slow work under political pressure. Crime groups adapted by compartmentalizing operations and insulating leaders. The chess match moved from streets to information. Core supporters argued that failure meant the country hadn't tried hard enough, not that the idea was wrong. They pointed to reduced public drunkenness and demanded more resources and stricter compliance. Movements rarely surrender easily because identity and moral certainty are involved. But even supporters could feel the cost of corruption and violence in their communities. The coalition was fighting both the black market and public fatigue. Neighboring countries and international ports created constant comparison. Alcohol was normal there, illegal here. This contrast made smuggling feel like importing ordinary goods into an unusual market. Rum runners exploited the perception that the ban was uniquely American and therefore uniquely profitable. The public saw the absurdity of chasing ships for something legal across the water. Policy isolation can increase black market pressure. As government budgets tightened, the lost alcohol tax revenue became a louder political argument. People asked why criminals should profit, while the state paid the enforcement bill. This is a systems argument. Regulate and tax demand instead of feeding black markets. Families facing economic strain cared more about jobs and stability than moral symbolism. Prohibition's fiscal logic was collapsing. By the early 1930s, repeal was no longer taboo. It was a serious conversation in newspapers, homes, and political offices. Supporters of repeal framed it as restoring respect for law and reducing crime incentives. Opponents feared moral backsliding, but the coalition was weakening under economic stress. The debate shifted from "should we ban" to "how do we manage alcohol safely?" The system was preparing to flip the switch back. By this point, the ban's legitimacy was collapsing faster than a legal supply could be reduced. When people stop believing a law is fair and effective, compliance becomes optional in their minds. Enforcement can't substitute for legitimacy at national scale. It can only chase symptoms. Economic pressure, safety fears, and corruption scandals combined into a powerful repeal wave. Act 7 shows how the Great Depression turns that wave into political action. The 1929 crash and the Great Depression shifted priorities toward jobs, revenue, and survival. When people are hungry, moral experiments feel less urgent than stability. Governments needed money, and alcohol taxes suddenly looked attractive again. Journalists covered suffering and policy debates side by side, connecting economics to repeal. Prohibition entered a new phase, crisis politics. Repeal advocates built a coalition around practical goals: restore tax revenue, reduce black market profits, and rebuild respect for law. They argued that regulation could manage harms better than a total ban. This reframed the debate from moral purity to harm reduction and governance. Media outlets spread the new argument, and politicians began testing it publicly. The repeal machine started to resemble the temperance machine, organizing, messaging, campaigning. As elections approached, candidates framed repeal as common sense, trying to align with everyday experience. When a policy's enforcement feels impossible, politicians compete to offer an exit ramp. Families listen differently now, less ideology, more practicality. Journalists amplified speeches and debates, making repeal a mainstream issue. Democracy turned the system's failure into a new choice. Depression budgets made enforcement costs harder to justify. Agents, courts, and prisons competed for money with relief programs and basic services. When resources are scarce, policy trade-offs become visible and painful. The government could either keep paying for a losing chase or redirect funds to recovery. Economic reality pushed repeal from idea to necessity. Repeal required reversing the constitutional switch, leading to the 21st Amendment. Using another amendment acknowledged the scale of the experiment. The fix had to be as strong as the mistake in the public's eyes. Supporters argued this would restore respect for the Constitution by ending an unworkable rule. Opponents warned repeal would unleash social harms again. The nation prepared for another ratification race. The 21st Amendment used state conventions for ratification, highlighting democracy's machinery in action. Delegates debated, voted, and responded to public pressure from communities hit hardest by the policy's failures. Families watched the process closely because it affected everyday life and local economies. Media coverage turned convention halls into national stages. Repeal advanced through procedure, not revolution. As repeal neared, legitimate businesses prepared to reopen under regulation, planning taxes, licenses, and quality control. This represented a shift from underground risk to controlled commerce. Governments anticipated revenue and jobs from legal production and distribution. Families expected safer products and fewer crime incentives. Repeal promised to replace the Shadow River with a regulated pipeline. Organized crime did not vanish when repeal approached. Groups adapted, seeking new revenue streams. A black market built for alcohol could be repurposed for gambling, protection, and other illegal trades. This is an important legacy. Once a network exists, it can change what it sells. Law enforcement had to evolve from chasing alcohol to dismantling organizations. Prohibition's shadow remained even as the law changed. As ratifications accumulated, the nation approached the moment of repeal. For some, it was relief. For others, disappointment. For many, it was pragmatic acceptance. Economists and officials focused on revenue and regulation, while families hoped for safety and stability. The press framed it as the end of an era and a lesson in policy limits. The constitutional padlock was about to open. By early 1933, repeal had become inevitable because the system's incentives were aligned against the ban. But repeal could not instantly undo the institutions Prohibition created: crime networks, corruption habits, and policing methods. Families wanted normalcy, agents wanted workable rules, and officials wanted revenue and legitimacy back. The country was about to flip the switch, but it would not return to the exact past. Act 8 closes the experiment: repeal, regulation, and the long shadow Prohibition left behind. In December 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed Prohibition, ending the national ban on alcohol. The country didn't give up so much as admit the system failed to produce its promised outcomes. Legal alcohol returned under regulation, taxes, and state-level rules. For many families, the hope was simple: fewer criminals, safer products, and more predictable law. Repeal was the end of the ban and the beginning of a new regulatory era. Repeal did not mean no rules, it meant different rules: licensing, taxation, and standards. Regulation aims to manage harm by controlling quality, access, and revenue, rather than pretending demand disappears. This is a system shift from prohibition to governance. Courts and police could redirect attention from chasing bottles to addressing real violence and corruption. The new system tried to bring alcohol back into the light. Organized crime did not disappear with repeal. Networks and habits built during Prohibition took time to weaken. Some groups pivoted to other illegal markets, while others tried to influence legal businesses through intimidation or corruption. Law enforcement learned that dismantling organizations is harder than stopping one product. Journalists continued to track the legacy, reminding the public that the experiment had long consequences. Prohibition's shadow was not a switch, it was a fade. Prohibition accelerated modernization of policing, coordination, investigation techniques, and federal-state relationships. Some tools were useful, but the era also showed the danger of expanding enforcement without legitimacy. Courts and agencies developed procedures for handling complex networks and financial crimes. The lesson wasn't never enforce laws, it was match capacity, clarity, and consent. Institutional habits formed during Prohibition shaped later decades of law enforcement. After repeal, the speakeasy era became part of American mythology. Jazz nights, hidden doors, and rebellion stories. Myths simplify. They remembered glamour more than corruption and danger. Families and communities remembered Prohibition differently depending on who was harmed or helped. Culture kept the aesthetic even as the law ended. History often turns policy failure into nostalgia, unless lessons are deliberately preserved. Prohibition demonstrated a durable systems lesson. Banning a wanted product can create a premium market for suppliers who accept risk. Risk becomes price, price becomes profit, and profit attracts organization. If enforcement capacity is limited, the black market becomes resilient by rerouting. Families experience this as higher prices, lower safety, and a culture of evasion. Policy design must consider incentives, not only intentions. Another lesson is about legitimacy. Compliance is driven more by belief in fairness than by fear of punishment. Force can chase symptoms, but legitimacy changes behavior at scale. When a law becomes widely ignored, enforcement turns into selective punishment, which further damages legitimacy. Courts become overloaded, and citizens learn to distrust the system. Prohibition shows why policy needs public consent and practical enforceability. Repeal returned power to states, creating a patchwork of alcohol rules that varied widely. Some places stayed dry locally, while others embraced regulation and taxation quickly. This patchwork reflected American federalism, one country, many policy experiments at once. The lesson is that governance continues after repeal, rules still shape behavior. Prohibition ended, but America's alcohol debate did not. Prohibition began with real hopes: safer families, less harm, and a moral reset. But the system it created rewarded smuggling, corruption, and dangerous substitutes because demand stayed alive. Enforcement couldn't keep up with geography and incentives, and legitimacy eroded as hypocrisy spread. Repeal didn't erase every problem, but it replaced a failing ban with regulated governance. The big takeaway is simple: when you design rules, you also design the incentives people will follow. If you like stories that explain history as choices, incentives, and consequences, you're in the right place. Prohibition shows how one bold idea can reshape culture, crime, and government, often in surprising ways. Tiny Titan's history is all about making big systems understandable with clear scenes and human-scale moments. Subscribe for more episodes where the past becomes a map of cause and effect. Let's time travel again, one turning point at a time.